Square. And today on the NASDAQ Spotlight, we have Weber Shandwick visiting to talk about the employer credibility gap and how to deepen employee engagement and retention. Today, I'm joined by Leslie Gaines-Ross and Sarah Clayton from Weber Shandwick. Thank you so much for joining us, ladies.
Delighted to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
So, for our friends on Facebook who might not understand the study, will you talk to us a little bit about the employment gap?
Sure. We did a survey among 1,900 employees around the world, so it was in 19 markets. It was with KRC Research, and what we did was we wanted to understand how can you deepen employee engagement, or how can you manage all of this talent and recruitment that's going on, especially in a time where there's a real war for talent. So we did this survey fairly recently to find out what can companies do to build a stronger employer brand. And we found out there's a very big credibility gap.
And who took the survey?
Employees, people had to be employed, they had to work in companies for 30 or more hours, they were 20 to 65 years old, so employed citizens around the world, basically.
And so what is exactly an employer brand?
It's a good question.
It is. So it's different than a corporate brand, different than a consumer brand. An employer brand is very specifically focused on a company's reputation as a place to work, and that includes its employee value proposition or the promise that it makes to its employees. And effective employer brands are also differentiated, so they really highlight what makes the employer unique, what it uniquely offers. And it's interesting, if we were to do a Google search today, Josh, for the term employer brand, we would probably get something like 20 million results. But 10 years ago, that number was closer to 44,000. So that represents an increase of 450 times just in the last decade. And I think what that tells us is that there really is a growing interest in employer branding, both as a concept and a discipline, certainly among our clients at Weber Shandwick, but also among companies generally.
And is the rise of this due to kind of the war on, the war for talent?
Yeah, there are several factors at play that are really relevant here. And I think the one that we would flag first is low employee engagement rates globally, and those rates are actually declining. So one of the findings from our study is that the current global employee engagement level is 27%, and that's down from 30% in 2014. And what that means is as we see more and more disengaged employees, they're going to be looking for other options, re-entering the talent pool, and companies really need to be proactive in getting out in front of those people. LinkedIn actually did some research that shows that employers who don't invest in their reputation with those prospects actually end up paying almost $5,000 more in terms of cost per hire than companies who do. That's a big number.
That is a huge number.
Yeah, and I thought I would add in, there's the other factor has to do with there's so much change in the workforce today that in the survey, 85% of employees around the world said that they've experienced a major transformation in their company. It's usually a leadership change, which we know really impacts everyone.
Definitely.
But also, there have been a lot of, and we all know this, an introduction of a new organizational structure. So employees around the world are experiencing so much change, and you really want them to feel tied to your employer brand. You don't want them to be looking elsewhere. And with the low unemployment numbers, you also realize that your competitors are going after your employees moment by moment. So you want to really tie your employees to the company, to the employer brand, believe in it, and just feel that love.
So one of the surprising stats, I think, from your study was that only 19% of employees' experiences actually represented how that employer actually represents itself. Why is that? And can you tell us a little more about it?
Yeah, I'll say a word about that. So it is surprising. The alignment between how a company talks about itself, and that could be in its communications, on its careers website, and its behavior, and then what employees actually experience on the inside really gets to the heart of a company's employer brand. And so it is surprising to know that only 19% of employees globally really feel like their employers are walking the talk and delivering on the promises they've made. 74% of those in our survey feel like they work for marginally aligned employers, so that means more or less maybe. And that group is really an opportunity for companies to go out and say, hey, what were your expectations when you joined? Where did we fall short? How can we rectify things? And really build trust with that group again. And then we had 7% of employees in the study who just kind of flat out said, look, my organization is fully not aligned, and there's not much you can do do with those folks. But I think the important point to make here is that this credibility gap is actually really expensive. I know we saw some data that in 2015 in the U.S. alone, companies spent almost $250 billion on recruitment efforts. And when you consider that a lot of what they're putting out there just is not listened to or believed or viewed as credible, it's really a lot of money that's going to waste.
Absolutely. So how can companies go about closing this credibility gap and making sure that what they're saying is actually what people externally and their employees are saying?
Well, I think you have to start with really understanding what your employees perceive about the company. You want to really do an inventory and see what are you communicating publicly, what are you saying, how are you walking the talk, what are the leadership and the values and the purpose, and pulling that all together and seeing what is the gap, what is your credibility gap, and then really coming up with a realistic plan to address that.
Got it. Well, Weber Shandwick works with some of the world's most leading companies. What are some of the things that in your opinions, employers can do to attract and retain the best talent?
It's interesting. We had that same question, and so we actually really wanted to learn from that 19% of aligned employers in the study. These are companies that are kind of best in class. So we actually did that analysis to understand what they do well when it comes to attraction and retention. And we found 3 things, which I think are very interesting. So first, they have a clear purpose and values, and they live their purpose and values. So these are companies that are making a difference in the world. They are committed to treating their employees fairly. They have good character. The second thing was really around leadership. And what we found there is that these organizations are places where leadership is trusted. Leadership is trying to build a good culture. They're trying to create a good employee experience. They're responsive to problems as they come up. Employees really feel like confidence in their leadership. And then the third characteristic is good old-fashioned internal communications. So these employees say, look, I know where my company's headed. I know the vision. I know the strategy. I feel like I'm informed. And those are the 3 things that really set that 19%, that group of aligned employers, apart from the rest.
Oh, I got it. That makes a lot of sense. So talk to me a little bit about employee activism. Like, how can you turn your employees into brand ambassadors, into the real advocates that most employer brands really need to be successful?
Well, a few years ago, about 2014, we did a survey on employee activism, and I think that we at Weber Shandwick actually coined that term, because the idea is that if you have employees who, let's say in this case, are aligned or they're very, very tied to the organization's purpose and leadership and values, then you can actually turn them into an army of advocates. So employee activists are really individuals at your company that will defend you, that will advocate for you online. They'll make their engagement very, very visible. They'll be online talking about what they do, what their employer is all about.
Are you talking like social or Glassdoor or where?
Social, and that's interesting, yes, and Glassdoor as well. They'll go on and talk about this is a really good company to work for and the reasons why and what you can expect in the culture. Or they'll just go on the company Facebook page and they'll tweet about the company. So what we found, which was so astounding, is that about 50% of employees were online talking about their employer, and the companies were like, they had no idea, and they had not really even developed a social media policy. So our thinking is that find those aligned employees and really turn them into a force of nature practically, and have them help spread word of mouth and say that this is a great company to work for.
And I would just add, Josh, I think a really great example of a company that's doing that is Cisco Systems out in Silicon Valley.
Yes.
So they actually had a very recent and deliberate pivot in terms of their employer branding strategy. And they were all about giving employees a louder voice and really being authentic with candidates and prospects about what it's like to work there. And Carmen Collins, who I think you know, she is the head of social media. Yeah, the head of social media for their talent brand. And she kind of described it by saying that, you know, we stopped posting like we were a 70,000 person company and started posting like we were 70,000 individuals working for that company. And so what you saw was a real change in their tone. It kind of went from corporate to what she calls coworker tone, very informal and real and conversational. And that's played out in a fantastic recruiting blog called Life at Cisco. They've also let employees run with Snapchat and capture the culture there. So the authenticity that they've really tried to capture has paid off for them.
Authenticity is so crucial, and that's such great learnings from Carmen. Cisco is really at the forefront of this. So after the study, were there other learnings that, or perhaps advice that you would have for employers following this study?
Well, I wanted to add that one of the, in the survey, which was really important, it's important to employers, is that there's a real return on investment. And that has to do with when you have aligned employees, you're much more likely to better your retention, your recruitment, your advocacy, and your productivity. So we found out that these really aligned, supercharged individuals who really are matched to the company and really have had the experience of working in a company that matches what they believe about the company, that they are more likely to recommend it as a place to work, they're more likely to be very productive, they're more likely to stay, which is very, very important. And they are just all around going to be your army of advocates.
That's fantastic. Well, Leslie and Sarah, thank you so much for joining us here on Facebook Live. And thank you for sharing the results of your Weber-Shandwick study. And we look forward to hearing more.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Facebook. Stay tuned. We've got more to come the rest of the day here at the NASDAQ market site in Times Square.